This episode of Infinite Scroll is brought to you by BRITA. From water talk to the emotional support water bottle, Gen Z and millennials have developed an obsession with water and staying hydrated. So if you're ready to take your hydration game to the next level, BRITA is the way to go. With Brita's water filter jugs, you can enjoy pure and fresh tasting filtered water straight from any tap. By ditching single-use plastic bottles, you'll be doing your bit for the planet and drinking water that tastes amazing. Brita doesn't just filter water, it filters out the guilt of plastic waste. Thank you to Brita for supporting the pod, helping us keep our deep dives going, and of course, keeping us hydrated. On May 21st, 2022, TikTok creator Taylor Frankie Paul posted to the short-form video app with a significant revelation. The video, captioned "An Unfortunate Announcement," revealed that she and her husband Tate were getting a divorce. Quote, "In my 20s, getting divorced, starting therapy, living on my own for the first time ever, along with 2 little kids." The text read on screen. Her followers were shocked, immediately speculating what could have prompted the breakup. Did someone cheat? Did social media put too much strain on their relationship? Or was it something more unexpected? A few days later, Taylor went live to share more. She claimed that she and Tate had been quote-unquote soft swinging with a group of their friends, meaning they could be intimate with others in the group, but there were certain rules. Taylor admitted she had broken those rules. While Taylor's viral confession may have marked the end of her marriage, unbeknownst to Taylor at the time, it also marked the beginning of a brand new era for her career. You see, Taylor Frankie Paul was one of the biggest names in Mom Talk, a TikTok collective of Utah-based Mormon women who had gone viral during the pandemic for their synchronized dances, matching athleisure, beautiful houses, and huge traditional families. Taylor's confession shattered the group's wholesome, godly image, spawning countless articles, videos, and commentary pieces about TikTok's Mormon soft-swinging scandal. It also spawned Taylor's next career move, as the star on Hulu's new reality TV series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, that was greenlit following the drama. What may have sounded like frivolous, though scandalous, internet drama at first, clearly highlighted something more significant: just how intertwined pop culture, the digital world, and the American state of Utah have become. From Pinterest's OG fashion bloggers to TikTok's Mom Talk, to reality TV's The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, Utah has seemingly embedded itself into the fabric of online culture in a major Mormon way. In this episode, we explore how this happened. Why are we so fascinated with Utah content creators? What is it about Mormonism that has captivated pop culture fanatics? And how exactly did Utah become the capital of the internet? From Centennial World, I'm Lauren Meisner, and this is Infinite Scroll, a podcast about internet culture, the creator economy, and how social media is shaping Gen Z. Welcome back to Infinite Scroll, everyone. Okay, this is our final major video essay of the year. We still have 2 deep dives going up in December, but they're going to be chattier, they're going to be more casual. I think they'll both actually be with myself and Annabelle together, which will be a nice change, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy that. But yes, we have been sitting on this topic for months. One of my best friends, Crystal Andrews, who runs Z-Feed, she was like, please, you need to do a deep dive into how Utah has become like the pinnacle of pop culture, like the capital of the internet, because we were talking about that one day, and I was like, you know what? We need to do it. So we are diving in today. I'm so excited. This episode combines so many things that I personally love and I'm personally fascinated by, and I hope you guys enjoy it too. But before we get into it, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. We're trying to get to 1,000 Spotify star ratings by the end of the year. You can always buy us a coffee as well. There is a link in our description for that if you want to support the pod. And please subscribe to our newsletter called Keep Scrolling For. We publish 3 times a month on Fridays. To explore this question properly, we need to look at the context in which Utah creators and celebrities exist. That is through the lens of Mormonism. The state of Utah is dominated by Mormon culture. Stats vary, however, most sources suggest that about 60% of the state are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. aka Mormons. And whether you identify with the religion or not, there's no denying that the church still has mass influence over how Utah residents live their lives. These days, we no longer have to live in Utah or even the United States to be familiar with Mormonism and its practices. Many of us would know that many Mormons do not consume coffee, alcohol, or tobacco, for instance. More conservative members of the church don't have sex before marriage, and they wear specific undergarments designated by the church. We see elements of the religion all over our social media, on our TikTok For You page, in our YouTube recommendations, and nestled within some of the content of our favorite creators. There are clear faces and moments that have come to define Mormonism within internet culture. So, for the purpose of this episode, we may speak about Utah and Mormonism somewhat interchangeably, as so much of Utah's cultural capital right now stems from Mormonism and our interest in the community. And before I get into it, I do want to caveat that in no way is this episode about passing judgment on Mormonism or mocking their practices or beliefs. We are simply looking into how and why this group has become such an integral part of internet culture. Let's first start with some background. While Mormonism has left a mark on internet culture on an international level, it is a uniquely American phenomenon. Mormonism emerged in the Second Great Awakening and completely disrupted the United States religious and political landscape. From the very beginning, Mormonism faced scrutiny and skepticism, a phenomenon that has persisted through until today. But to better understand its origins, stereotypes, and perceptions, we are chatting with Associate Professor David Smith from the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. He specializes in the intersection of religion and politics, with a regional focus on the United States. He is also the author of Religious Persecution and Political Order. Welcome, Dr. David Smith.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to chat with you about all things religion, Mormonism, Utah, pop culture. But before we get into that, could you just share with our listeners a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. My area of research is all about religion and politics, especially in the United States. I spent 7 years in the United States doing my PhD at the University of Michigan. And my PhD was about the treatment of religious minorities in the US, including a long section on Mormons.
I love it. All right, so could you give us then a brief overview of how Mormonism originated?
Sure. So the official name of the religion is Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it was founded by Joseph Smith in the 1830s. That was a time when there were all kinds of new Christian sects constantly coming into existence in the US. But what made Joseph Smith's new religion different was that he really claimed to be a prophet of God. And he claimed that the Book of Mormon, which he had transcribed with the help of the angel Moroni, was a religious text that was equal in authority to the Bible. And this didn't sit well with a lot of Joseph Smith's Christian neighbours, especially since he was very successful. He got a lot of followers very quickly. So his church kept getting chased out of various American states. When they got to Missouri, they actually ended up in a civil war with anti-Mormon militias in Missouri who were backed by the Missouri government. There was actually an extermination order issued against Mormons by the governor of Missouri. And there was a massacre of Mormons at a place called Horns Mill, which still has this notorious place in Mormon memory. So they were forced to flee to Illinois, to a city called Nauvoo. They still had problems with their neighbours in Illinois. And Joseph Smith was eventually murdered by an anti-Mormon militia. Most new religions die when their founder dies, especially if their founder dies violently. But Joseph Smith had made it clear that the role of prophet would be passed on to somebody else, and it is to this day. The president of the Mormon Church is always regarded as a prophet who has privileged communication with God. So the second Mormon prophet was Brigham Young, who led the Mormons from the United States all the way to Utah, which wasn't even part of American territory when they left. And they were in fact trying to get away from the United States altogether. But when they got there, it had been conquered by the United States in the Mexican-American War. But the President of the United States thought it would be useful to have these Mormons there as white Americans who could help govern this huge territory which stretched from what would today be California to Colorado. But even though they were allowed to settle there, because of the fact that they were practicing plural marriage, which we usually know as polygamy, that is the practice of men having multiple wives, they again were in constant conflict with the federal government. And when the federal government sent its officers to Utah to try to enforce federal law, they kept finding that their officers would catch on fire or things like that. They would try to convict Mormons of polygamy, but all the juries would be made up of Mormons, so they weren't able to. So there was this whole federal campaign against the Mormons that lasted for decades, that even included a short-lived war when they tried to send federal troops to Utah. But in the end, it was accomplished by legislation. They basically threatened the Mormons with being put out of existence if they didn't abandon the practice of polygamy, which they eventually did.
Wow. Okay. So I wanted to take it back a little bit to when you said that Joseph Smith, he was able to build a following quite quickly, and a big following. Was there a specific cultural or political, moment in time that enabled that? Or was it just that he was super charismatic? Like, do we know why he was able to build such a loyal following?
It was a combination of both of those things. This was the time known as the Second Great Awakening in American history, a time of great religious revival, which saw a huge increase in religious practice in the United States. So the times were very ripe. But the other really important thing was he, from the beginning, sent his two brothers out to go and talk to people to convert them. These were the first two Mormon missionaries. And to this day, all over the world, we can see pairs of usually male Mormon missionaries going around talking to people about Mormonism. So that practice was pioneered back in the 1830s. It was very successful. Mormons do not convert the vast majority of people that they talk to. There's been one study that suggests it's maybe 1 in every 72,000. But when they do convert people, those people then go and convert other people, often their own family members or their friends. So that practice of really actively going and converting people has been a highly successful one over history. And it's one of the reasons why Mormons, in some estimates, are one of the fastest growing religions in history. They now have, there are different estimates about how many members that they have worldwide. The minimum estimate that I've seen is 8 million. It might be as high as 16 million. This is a very fast-growing religion. That's equal to the kind of growth that Christianity had in its first 200 years. So it continues to be a very high-growth religion.
So then, initially, it sounds like Mormons or Latter-day Saints were considered disruptive and kind of breaking the status quo. And I would argue now, at least from what we see in pop culture, that perception has shifted. The culture is seen as much more like on the straight and narrow, following kind of traditional gender roles and all of that. Would you agree that that perception has shifted? And what do you think has contributed to that?
So Mormons themselves, at the turn of the 20th century, were determined that they would become a much more mainstream American religion. They didn't want to be outsiders anymore. What brought that to a head was when the Senate refused to seat Utah's first senator, Reed Smoot, because of the fact that they suspected that Mormons were still practicing polygamy. And because of that, the Mormon church hierarchy themselves became really active in enforcing monogamy, making sure that there was nobody who was still engaging in this practice. Those who wanted to keep engaging in it had to form their own sect and flee to the borderlands of Colorado and Arizona. So Mormons very self-consciously made themselves a more assimilated part of American society. They're no longer as geographically isolated as they once were. Even though Utah is still about 70% Mormon, you can find Mormons all over the United States and, in fact, all over the world. There used to be this stereotype that Mormons weren't just disruptive, but that they were actually violent. And that's what came out of the context of Mormons being engaged in physical battle with their neighbours who wanted to get rid of them. In 1857, there was a notorious incident called the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This was during the Utah War, when Mormons who had disguised themselves as Native Americans attacked a wagon train of immigrants, killing hundreds of people. And the memory of that violence, it's never completely gone away. There was I think it was a Netflix streaming series earlier this year called American Primeval, which was about that event. And a few years ago, there was another streaming series called Under the Banner of Heaven, which was looking at murders in a Mormon fundamentalist sect in the 1980s and kind of linking them back to this early, very violent history of the church. But on the whole, Mormons have been very successful in and very genuine in presenting themselves as these really friendly and neighbourly people. These days, Mormons are the kinds of people that you want to have as your neighbours, not the kinds of people that you want to get rid of, because they're considered very hardworking, very honest, very clean living, embodying all of these ideas that Americans really think are at the heart of American life. And certainly areas where a lot of Mormons live are generally considered very, very safe areas. So certainly the way that Mormons interact with other people, nearly always in this very kind of friendly and open way, this has really contributed to this real change in how Mormons are viewed. There's also been a really significant change in the way that they are represented in all forms of pop culture.
Now that we have a sense of the religion's origins, as well as how this religion was initially perceived, we can start to break down how and why internet users have become so fixated on this group. We will also hear more from Dr. David Smith later in the episode, when we discuss some theories explaining why Mormonism resonates so strongly within internet culture. From our research, we noticed 4 broad categories, or eras, of Utah-based content creators online: the OG mommy bloggers, the family vloggers and tradwives, the observers and outsiders, and finally, the ExMo community. Let's take it back to where it all began: the Mormon mommy bloggers. We are all familiar with today's momosphere. Scroll through TikTok long enough and you will come across aesthetic videos of women preparing meals for their children or perfectly edited montages of women peacefully cleaning the house. It is a haven for parenting, relationships, cooking, and general domestic content on social media. And it was the Mormon mommy bloggers who practically invented it. Through the 2000s and 2010s, Mormon women began sharing their tips and reflections on marriage, motherhood, and family life through personal blogs. They did so with such consistency and influence that they were quickly inducted into the Bloggernacle, a portmanteau of blog and tabernacle, that came to be known as the corner of the internet, specializing in LDS matters and topics. Like any online niche, there was diversity among the mommy bloggers. Some of these women put their faith front and center, while others, it was less salient. And perhaps ironically, it was Heather Armstrong, an ex-Mormon, who really skyrocketed mommy blogging into the mainstream. Best known for Deuce.com, Heather blogged on and off from 2001 until her passing in 2023. At its peak, Deuce drew in around 8.5 million readers a month, with Heather speaking candidly about the highs and lows of parenthood as she raised 2 daughters. Though Heather wasn't the archetypal Mormon mother, she is an example of how deeply Mormonism influenced this niche, by the very fact that someone raised in the church would go on to be dubbed the Queen of the Mommy Bloggers by the New York Times in 2011, and the original influencer 12 years later. That being said, there were many mommy bloggers who openly discussed their Mormon faith in their content, and did so through a positive lens. Noami Davis is one such example. Better known online as Taza, she started a joint blog with her husband called The Rockstar Diaries. At first, it was a way for her to share their newlywed life with family and friends, but her readership quickly grew, and she soon developed a fervent global following, managing to monetize her online presence. Both Noami and her husband were Mormon, with blog posts speaking openly about her faith, alongside her family, marriage, and eventually children. But what was interesting about women like Noami is how they managed to make Mormonism appear completely aspirational. This phenomenon is best put in a 2015 piece by Jen Gann for The Cut. As the journalist wrote, quote, "I didn't realize it at the time, but I think I first became drawn to Noami's blog for what seems to be the clarity of her existence. Of course, she wasn't straining for a real career. Of course, she would have her babies before turning 30. Of course, she would follow, maybe a company is a better word, her husband, without any ugly resentment. Having said that, Noami was not without criticism. Even a decade ago, there were Reddit threads discussing the ethics of her commodifying her children or her faith to make a living. Conversations we are still having about creators today. At the time of recording, her blog is defunct, with Noami taking a step back from social media after facing significant criticism for her behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic. But as the second generation of mommy bloggers, Noami came up alongside creators like Rachel Parcell and Amber Fillerup Clark, known online as Pink Peonies and Barefoot Blonde, respectively. These women also managed to make Mormonism, marriage, and motherhood appear downright enviable. Rachel started blogging as a newlywed, while Amber launched Barefoot Blonde during a period of volunteering abroad. Both went on to become full-fledged influencers in their own right, building significant followings across multiple platforms. Writing for Allure, Alice Gregory speaks to Amber's appeal. Quote, "She's not wearing gunny sack dresses and praying beneath a high desert sun. She's eating shaved ice with her kids and prancing around in a bikini, which, while technically in defiance of Mormon scripture, is overshadowed by the fact that she continuously promotes an idealized vision of domestic Mormon life." By putting forth this modern and aspirational version of Mormonism, these Mormon mommy bloggers attracted an extremely diverse audience, both Mormons and non-Mormons alike. In doing so, these women managed to lay the foundation for Mormonism's entrenchment in internet culture and the beauty world specifically. In the years since the Mormon mommy bloggers debuted, a growing body of scholarship has explored the feminist impact of these blogs. Various scholars have argued that the bloggernacle, or the Mormon blogosphere, offered stay-at-home mothers a way to monetize and professionalize their domestic work, leaning into a kind of neoliberal feminism built around entrepreneurship. While that is a somewhat limited interpretation of feminism, it is a valid point, and an important part of understanding how these creators changed what it meant to show up as a Mormon woman online. As one journal article, Digital Pioneers, Mormon Mommy Bloggers, and Building the Bloggernacle puts it, quote, "While this aim of monetization can be read as a natural result of the commodifying nature of the digital platformed ecosystem, the work of Mormon mommy bloggers was in another sense potentially subversive. For Mormon mommy bloggers, blogging was in many ways a radical act insofar as it represented an act of real or aspirational labor that ran contrary to religious expectations for Mormon women and also opened a space for a range of feminist discussions. However, the potentials of feminist community building amongst pro-am creators was ultimately limited. As the internet moved beyond the blogging era, so did the Mormon mommy creators. We have already discussed the #MomTalkWomen in the intro of this episode, but they are just one example. Enter Mormon mommy vloggers, family channels, and the Tradwives. This content was also about parenting, child rearing, and marriage, but it felt different. Part of this might come down to the shift in format. Video allows for deeper connection and stronger parasocial relationships to develop. Another difference comes down to the commodification of the influencer space more broadly. Many viewers started to take a more critical eye to this kind of content, especially with children featured on family channels. One of the most famous LDS family channels is the Shaytards, led by Shay and Colette Butler. In fact, the Shaytards are widely considered the first ever family vloggers, with their first video being posted back in 2008. Since then, family channels have, unfortunately, grown massively in popularity. With a Mormon family pioneering this niche, it once again shows how deeply Mormonism has influenced internet culture. While the Shaytards paved the way for this kind of content, the most extreme example might just be 8 Passengers. We definitely do not need to reiterate all the horrible events that have happened over the past few years, but we will give a brief summary. It all started in 2015, when Utah-based couple Ruby and Kevin Franke launched 8 Passengers, with a gender reveal video for their 6th child. As members of the LDS Church, the Frankes would go on to incorporate their faith into their content. Like many family vloggers, the Frankes faced criticism for commodifying their children's lives, but concerns about their parenting went beyond the usual ethical debates around vlogging. Viewers began expressing concern over their seemingly punitive discipline methods. Over time, uploads became increasingly sporadic until the channel stopped posting altogether. This appeared to coincide with Ruby's involvement with a group called Connections, led by a woman named Jody Hildebrandt. Connections claimed to offer, quote, healing that psychotherapy cannot provide, but has since been described as cult-like and rooted in a kind of religious extremism. Ruby became deeply involved with the group, co-hosting social media content with Jody that promoted, quote, living in truth through harsh disciplinary principles. On August 30th, 2023, Ruby and Jody were arrested after one of Ruby's children escaped from Jody's home and sought help from a neighbor. Both later pleaded guilty to child abuse charges and were sentenced to up to 30 years in prison. This has arguably become one of the most influential moments in internet culture this decade, both politically and culturally. Prompted in part by the Frankie case, Utah has taken legislative action to protect children of social media creators and family vloggers. The law, which was passed earlier this year, forces parents who post their children online to deposit a percentage of their earnings into a trust for the child to access when they are 18. It also stipulates that when the child reaches 18, they may request creators to delete content from when they were a minor. While family vloggers represent one evolution of Mormon family content, Tradwives are another. We have explored Tradwives in depth on a previous episode of this podcast, which is definitely worth a listen. But if you didn't catch that episode, Tradwife stands for traditional wife. The term originated around 2015, but has seen a resurgence in the 2020s, particularly thanks to TikTok. A Tradwife typically creates content embracing traditional gender roles and showcasing life as a traditional homemaker. One prominent example is Ballerina Farm, whose real name is Hannah Nealman. A Juilliard-trained ballerina and former pageant queen, Hannah now lives in rural Utah with her husband Daniel, raising cattle, pigs, chickens, and 8 children, all featured in her highly curated content. While Hannah and her family are part of the LDS Church, we must make it clear that not all Tradwives are Mormon. At the same time, though, Tradwifery has become closely associated with Mormonism. This is likely because LDS teachings emphasize family and women's roles as wives and mothers, which many Mormon mommy vloggers naturally reflect in their content. We also see this clearly with Nara Smith, who really brought the term Tradwife into TikTok's lexicon. Although Nara's content is not overtly religious, she rarely, if ever, discusses her faith. Her apparent connection to Mormonism through her husband really solidified the association between the LDS Church and Tradwifery among young audiences. Having said that, what is particularly interesting is the shift in how people view Mormon Tradwives compared to the original Mormon mommy bloggers. The sentiment is largely negative, less aspirational, more critical. Part of this comes from online discourse, framing Tradwives as explicitly anti-feminist. Many of them create content encouraging their followers to submit entirely to their husbands and entrust them with full control over their lives. This portrayal is often misleading. Many Tradwives monetize their channels and YouTube presence, allowing them to establish some level of financial security, a reality that's in stark contrast to what they're promoting. Another criticism, and one that has become somewhat controversial, is the perception that the Tradwife movement can act as a gateway to the alt-right ideology. Tradwife content often focuses on domestic life, making meals from scratch, raising children, and homesteading. But sometimes, this lifestyle intersects with conspiratorial thinking about health and medicine. In other words, these women become what commentators call crunchy. The crunchy to alt-right pipeline examined by Kathleen Belew for The Atlantic has been well documented. In her piece, Belew argues that individuals who embrace the crunchy lifestyle become more susceptible to fear-mongering and conspiracy theories, fueled by pre-existing distrust of government, medicine, and other institutions. This, in turn, can serve as a channel for direct recruitment into the white power movement. All in all, while not every Tradwife is Mormon, many social media users have come to view this kind of content as a form of LDS propaganda, or at least as a drastic return to traditionalism. Whether that's an accurate assessment often depends on the individual creator. Nevertheless, this mentality has definitely seeped into the pop culture imagination. Now, many of the Tradwives and mommy bloggers that we have discussed have been members of the LDS Church. And if they're sharing their life online, it makes sense that their faith would be featured in their content to some degree. But there is another cohort of creators who exist outside the LDS Church in one way or another, and still choose to spotlight this group. We have categorized this group as the observers and outsiders. And yes, with this episode, we are definitely contributing to that space as well. Content that performs well within this niche often takes the form of street-style interviews or vox pops. Creators from across the United States will visit Brigham Young University, the flagship higher education institution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and chat with students about their beliefs. TikToker Robert Carpenter is one such example. He has posted clips asking students fairly rogue questions, ultimatums like Black History Month or the Book of Mormon. Robert himself is not Mormon and never attended BYU, but he started filming content there after he was invited to visit by some high school friends. The creator tells USA Today that his videos are not staged, though he acknowledges that some students are likely self-satirizing in their responses. Even so, his content highlights the often surprising perspectives within the BYU student body, epitomizing the trend of observer creators documenting Mormon life from the outside. Arguably, this style of content was popularized on social media by the Black Menaces, a TikTok collective that went viral in 2022. The group, made up of 5 Black students at Brigham Young University, came together to raise awareness about the experience of being a minority on campus. The vast majority of BYU students come from white privileged backgrounds, with Black students constituting around 1% of the student population. The group's content tackled quote-unquote controversial topics, including race, sexuality, and political affiliations. At the time, TikTok viewers were surprised by how conservative some BYU students are on social issues, answering no to questions like, "Are you a feminist?" or "Do you support gay marriage?" Of course, the co-founders of the Black Menaces, all 5 of whom have some connection to the LDS Church and attended BYU, were not observers in the same sense as Robert. But as minorities within the space, they were unfortunately casted as outsiders. Since their initial rise, the Black Menaces have expanded beyond BYU, establishing chapters at universities across the country and continuing to create content about race and social justice. In a similar vein, there is also the ExMo community. This is a cohort of creators who were once part of the Mormon Church, but have since left, and now create content about their experiences within it. The tone and intent of this content vary. Some creators use it as a form of catharsis or education, while others lean more into viral storytelling or expose-style videos. TikTok has become a hub for this content, with former LDS Church users sharing story times about how and why they left the church. One of the most prominent creators in this space is Alyssa Grenfell, who has shared her journey of faith deconstruction across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Alyssa also published a book titled How to Leave the Mormon Church, an ex-Mormon's guide to rebuilding after religion. We did reach out to Alyssa for comment in this episode, but she did not respond in time for recording. Another well-known creator is ExMo Lex, who built an audience over 6 years by creating content about leaving the church, before recently announcing that she would be stepping back from YouTube. Then, of course, there are long-standing platforms like Mormon Stories, the podcast hosted by John Dellin, which aims to, quote, explore, celebrate, and challenge Mormon culture through in-depth stories told by members and former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Ultimately, it's clear that there is a huge range of content emerging from within the Mormon Church online. When you look at this content as a whole, what stands out is that there is just as much interest in creating Mormon content from within the faith as there is in observing it from the outside. For the purposes of this deep dive, and because we are not members of the church ourselves, we will focus on the perspective of outsiders and observers. It's not our place to speak for the Mormon community, but rather dissect why so many people online have become so fascinated with it. Based on our breakdown, there has been a fairly consistent fascination with Mormon culture since the 2000s, but this niche definitely had a second wind in the early 2020s. And as usual, we have a couple theories as to why. On a fundamental level, this can be attributed to the evolution of content creation and sharing over the past 5 years. In the 2010s, monoculture was on its last legs, and the rise of TikTok completely destroyed a pop culture landscape driven by a single perspective. TikTok democratized virality, making online fame and influence accessible to anyone. As we hear from many social media experts and marketing managers, the online space is dominated by creators who, quote, niche down. Audiences have become accustomed to being exposed to groups, people, and lifestyles they would not normally encounter otherwise. In that sense, Mormon creators are just one example of the kinds of niches that now generate widespread attention. But when you take a moment to think about it more deeply, the renewed interest in Mormonism feels a little surprising, especially when you consider how secular much of the Western world has become over these past few decades. Take Australia, for example. According to 2021 census data, 38.9% of people reported having no religion, the second largest group behind Christianity. That was an 8-point jump from just 5 years earlier. In the United States, it was a similar story. According to data from Pew Research Center, the Christian share of the U.S. population has been steadily declining for almost 2 decades. In 2007, 78% of U.S. adults identified as Christian. That number has trickled downward, hitting the low 60s in the late 2010s. So, if people are rejecting religion, why would they be interested in this kind of content? This brings us to our first major theory. The rise of Utah-based and Mormon-focused content across social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube reflect the changing political, social, and religious consciousness of Gen Z. More and more Gen Zs, particularly young men, are starting to identify as religious or Christian. Granted, this could be a blip in the broader trend, especially since religious revivals often flare up during times of crisis. If we look specifically at the United States, though, data from Pew Research Center shows that the Christian share of the U.S. population has stabilized, and it is similar across other countries in the global north. Per reporting from The Economist, quote, in Canada, Britain, and France, the share of people telling pollsters they are irreligious has stopped growing. Across another 7 Western European countries, it has slowed markedly, rising by just 3 percentage points since 2020. Compared with a 14-point surge in the previous 5 years. Of course, there are many reasons for this plateau, but it is worth noting that many commentators point to Gen Z as one of the major reasons why. Even though Gen Z is still less religious than their parents or grandparents, they do show a renewed curiosity about faith and spirituality, which may partly explain the recent stabilization in the number of people identifying as no religion. In a piece for Vox, journalist Christian Paz highlighted a few possible explanations why Gen Z is finding religion now. For some young people, religion offers a way to combat the loneliness epidemic. For others, it's part of a broader countercultural movement, especially in Western democracies, where being irreligious has almost become the default. And finally, a return to religion and more traditional values aligns with the rightward, more conservative shift we are seeing among online culture. But more on this later. Other experts have made similar claims. Speaking to the turn of religion among young men specifically, Intafar Chowdhury writes for The Interpreter, quote, religion, especially traditions with male-led hierarchies, offers them belonging, purpose, and a defined role. Men are therefore turning to church for community rather than moral refuge. Therefore, with a growing interest in religion among young people, it's no surprise that we see it online, a space where Gen Z dominates. Of course, this type of content doesn't have to be exclusively Mormon-driven, but it is certainly one of the widespread examples. Coupled with the renewed interest in religion, we cannot ignore the turn toward more politically conservative messaging and traditionalism online, and how this may be feeding into an interest in Mormonism within internet culture. Before we get into this fully, we should make it clear that Mormon does not equal politically conservative, but there is definitely synergy between traditional perspectives and the LDS Church, something we've already touched on today when it comes to Tradwives. As we've discussed at length on this podcast before, there has been a notable shift to the political right across online spaces. From Elon Musk's takeover of X, to the rise of conspiratorial content, to the increasing frequency of transphobic hate. On top of this, recent research has shown how this ideological shift is shaping which voices dominate online discourse. According to a recent report by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, quote, in the United States, the vast majority of political commentary comes from creators who self-identify on the right. Similarly, data from the Pew Research Center, which we have cited previously, found that slightly more news influencers in the United States identify as Republican or conservative than as Democratic or liberal. Of course, these stats are just one part of a broader rightward shift happening online. And to be clear, we are not equating Mormon creators with conservative commentators. But what makes this comparison useful is that both groups often, intentionally or not, promote similar values, particularly around gender roles, family, and faith. In this sense, they can be understood within the same ideological context, where both are reflections of an increasingly conservative mainstream internet culture. Having said that, it's fair to say that certain aspects of Mormonism seem to resonate with online culture. So far, we've talked about this through the return of traditionalism and conservative values. But there's also something to be said about Mormon practices and their affinity with content creation. A prevailing theory among commentators is that elements of Mormon culture, such as missions and journal keeping, make content creation a natural fit for members of the church. Missions, for example, are inherently about outreach. So, sharing Mormon values or teachings online can be seen as an extension of these missions. And when it comes to journaling, which is something that many young women in the church are apparently encouraged to do, it naturally fosters storytelling skills, which are essential to content creation. Beyond that, journaling functions as a form of memory keeping, a practice that social media platforms like Instagram and YouTube have basically digitized. Ex-Mormon creator Alyssa Grenfell touches on both of these ideas in her video titled, "Why Are There So Many Mormon Influencers? A Theory?" Although she ultimately finds them unconvincing. As she points out, many non-Mormon women journal or have strong storytelling skills. But that alone doesn't make someone become an influencer. In other words, while Mormon practices and tradition are compatible with influencerdom, it doesn't necessarily explain the overrepresentation of this group in the creator economy. She points to various structural elements, raising a theory about how the church may financially uphold the so-called Mormon influencer industrial complex. This is not through direct payments to creators, but rather through ad ecosystems like AdSense, essentially using digital advertising infrastructure to boost and financially incentivize Mormon creators to promote their lifestyle. In the video, she explores how online marketing systems and keyword targeting might contribute to these opportunities.
So if we have these women who are identical in these different places, who do you think is going to give up first? If you're posting content and you're getting your little trickle of ad revenue, but if you live in New York and LA, it's just not enough to get by on. You either have to have maybe money from elsewhere, maybe money from your parents if you want to stay as an influencer. You might just give up because you're just not making enough money to make a living off of. However, if you're in Utah, you are making so much more money, and also just the cost of living is lower. You're not going to give up because you're making good money. You're going to tell your friends about it. Say, look at my phone. Look at how much money I earned from this blog post. Look at how much money I made from this video. You're going to tell your friends, and you're going to reinvest. You're going to buy better equipment. You're going to buy a prettier house. You're going to buy better makeup. You're going to use that money to make a machine that allows you to make bigger and better content. And you're going to tell all your friends so they start earning money too. More money in a pool means that more people can join the pool party. So if there's only a certain amount of advertising dollars to go around in a place like New York, not as many people can hang out at the pool because it's not going to support enough people to make a living. But if there's a larger amount of money to support the infrastructure of these Utah influencers, more and more influencers can join this economy of this huge sum of advertising dollars. They can all be making content. They can all be making money. And the church can have tons and tons of different representatives of women showing just how wonderful it is to be Mormon.
This isn't even to mention how much of the content produced by Mormon creators would be considered extremely brand safe because it is family friendly and family oriented. Nevertheless, Alyssa offers an interesting perspective on how Mormon creators might leverage the existing digital ecosystem to their advantage, ultimately contributing to their overrepresentation in internet culture. In a similar vein, the Utah aesthetic and social media's existing beauty standards is another factor that would play into their successes online. If you take a moment to think of some of the most popular Utah influencers that we have mentioned, the overwhelming majority are white, thin, and beautiful, with bouncy long hair. This signature Utah look is even a widely discussed topic on the secret lives of Mormon wives. In recent years, trends like the clean girl aesthetic and the return of super skinny body standards have further entrenched these beauty ideals within internet culture, benefiting Mormon content creators in the process. As we have noted before, certain social media algorithms tend to favor creators who appeal to specific aesthetics. In 2020, The Intercept famously leaked documents revealing that TikTok moderators were told to suppress content featuring people with, quote, ugly facial looks, too many wrinkles, abnormal body shapes, or backgrounds featuring slums and dilapidated housing. Since this leak, the so-called ugly content policy has been retired, and there have not been any significant revelations about TikTok's algorithm favoring certain types of content based on appearances since. Yet, bias remains evident. The majority of the most popular content creators are white and conform to established beauty standards. AI-generated content often perpetuates these biases, with platforms like TikTok and now Sora flooded with racist and discriminatory material, often targeting Black women. These dynamics have, intentionally or not, helped Mormon women, who often align with these standards, grow a following and build careers in content creation. In the second part of our conversation with Dr. David Smith, we explore this further. He highlighted another factor driving the influence of Mormon content creators online, the way aesthetics, culture, and traditions of the church might reflect an idealized version of America, one that many feel has been lost. Let's get into pop culture and Mormonism and why we feel like Utah has become the center of pop culture lately. So I guess it's interesting from an outsider's perspective, I'm obviously not in the culture, to watch how sensationalized, or kind of, I guess, the fascination that we all have with this culture. Where do you think that this stems from, first of all?
I think it does stem from the fact that this is the closest thing we can see to this idealized American culture that people associate with some period from about the 1850s to the 1950s, and which seems to have been lost otherwise. This world of friendly neighbours who help each other all the time. This world that, even though it's all about community, at the same time there's this big ethic of self-reliance, and people can essentially create entire meals from scratch, you know, starting with the pigs that they've raised on their own farm. So this combination of community and self-reliance, bringing together, once again, there's two ideals which many people think should be at the heart of American life. I think the idea that there are people out there who are successfully practicing this, but who are also just really social media savvy, I think this is the fascinating thing about it. And this whole sort of return to traditionalism on the internet, that's largely been pioneered by Mormons. And I think that that's why people are so fascinated.
Yeah, I remember the first time I realized that so many of the original Instagram influencers that I followed were Latter-day Saints, and I didn't even really know what that was. And I was listening to a podcast talking about this, and I was like, I have followed these women for years. I had no idea. And then that sparked my fascination. And I was like, how do all of these women who are like in their mid-20s have 8 children and they dress so perfectly? They live in these huge houses. They're so beautiful. And I had no idea they were part of this religion. Like, it just fascinated me so much.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people these days, their first contact with the Mormon world is through this kind of culture. And as you say, they usually have no idea that this is what they're looking at. So whereas when Mormons talk to you about Mormonism, they're very open about who they are, and they've got name tags indicating they're part of Church of Latter-day Saints, and they've got the Book of Mormon with them. There's no mistaking them for anything else. When people encounter Mormonism in these cultural ways, it's often very different. And in a very different way, 20 years ago, there was a movie called Napoleon Dynamite, which is very popular at the time, very quirky. Most people had no idea that they were looking at a Mormon movie.
I had no idea. Oh my God.
It's depicting an entire Mormon world in an almost entirely Mormon town in Idaho. Wow. And you have to look very carefully to see the indicators of this. At one point, Napoleon wears a T-shirt for a branch of Brigham Young University that's in Idaho. He shops at a place called the ZCMI, which is a Mormon cooperative. So that the clues are very, very subtle. But this was one of the first kind of real cultural assertions I'd seen of Mormonism. And even though Napoleon Dynamite, it's it's very kind of quirky, and you don't necessarily want to be Napoleon Dynamite, but you admire him. At the same time, once again, it did depict this kind of world of community and self-reliance, and also very rural values, and people living in this very kind of rustic way. So, often people are looking at Latter-day Saints culture, or at least at some idealization of Latter-day Saints culture, without realizing that that is what it is that they are looking at.
Yeah, to me, it appears so aspirational, especially when I was younger and I was first learning about all the creators that I followed who were part of this religion. I was like, okay, maybe I should become a Latter-day Saint if that's what their lifestyle looks like. It's so influential in that way. So I wanted to take it back to what you were saying about missionary work. We know missionary work and journal keeping is important in Mormonism. Do you see a connection between these practices and the rise of Mormon creators online?
Yeah, certainly there's a very good fit between these things, because that kind of missionary work and journal keeping, it really encourages these reflective practices, and it teaches people to be able to talk about their own experiences and their own inner life, which are really important skills. So certainly for Mormons, this is a very important part of openness and accountability. It just translates very, very well into the internet. I mean, sort of confession is one of the currencies of the internet, and it is something that fits just very well with the Mormon lifestyle. So there is absolutely a really good fit between these two things.
Yeah, I also, that first podcast that I listened to that kind of opened my eyes to this years ago was also theorizing that the reason why we do have so many Mormon influencers, and this was, again, like I said, about 5 years ago, so it's nothing like it is now. I feel like TikTok has really accelerated an interest in this culture and these creators, was because women are encouraged to typically work from the home or to stay home. And so social media is something you can do from home. And of course, there's a big focus on the beauty around you. And so everything looks so aspirational and so aesthetic and so beautiful, which translates really well to social media as well.
Yeah, and I mean, a couple of other things worth mentioning here. Latter-day Saints, on the whole, are a wealthy group. They are the second wealthiest religious minority in the United States, behind Hindus. So not all Mormons are rich, but there often is a significant affluence behind these Mormon influences. And I suppose that whole lifestyle that they're engaging in, that's a lot easier to do if you're wealthy than it is if you're not wealthy. The other thing is that, even though you see this tradwife culture with women staying home, the vast majority of Mormon women work. Now, often it is in some kind of entrepreneurial capacity, working from home, but it's a tenet of Mormonism that you should have as many children as you can support. And so it's often important for both parents to work in order to be able to support children. And this leads to the real emphasis on community, or it's part of the real emphasis on community in Mormon culture, because it's a lot easier to have both parents working if you're living in a community where people can basically take communal responsibility for raising children. And that's one of the other things that is in the background of this whole Mormon influencer culture. I mean, as you're saying, how is it that you can have 8 children and be a successful entrepreneur and just look so perfect all the time? Partly it's because of communal child rearing practices. Your own children aren't necessarily eating at your home every night. They'll be eating at neighbours some nights, and some nights you're going to have other people's children over at your home. I think that this is one of the other things that really enables that lifestyle, and also makes it quite difficult for non-Mormons to replicate it. Even though our culture and probably these influences encourage this picture of you're doing it all yourself and you're doing it all perfectly, it doesn't work without having a really significant community behind you, which not everybody has.
I would love to hear your perspective on whether the popularity of Mormon creators or just Mormon-related content in general ties into that broader return of, the interest in tradwife lifestyle that we've been mentioning here and there in this interview. Do you think that there's a relationship between the two, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, certainly for conservative-minded people, I think that even though a lot of conservative Christians, for example, wouldn't regard Mormons as real Christians, nonetheless, they see the kind of life and the community that they've achieved as something to aspire to. Something that we also can't ignore is that there's this particular kind of whiteness associated with Mormonism. And a lot of the original Mormons all came from groups of English and Scandinavian settlers. And when you see Mormons, your stereotypical image of them is as white people. And most of these influences are also white. The Church of the Latter-day Saints has had a troubled history with race. It wasn't really until the 1970s that they allowed people of African descent into the church. And since then, they've really taken off in Africa, as they've taken off in many parts of the non-European world. But nonetheless, the world that we see portrayed to us through these influences, it is a very white world. And to many people, once again, it represents this kind of lost American whiteness and lost American traditionalism, which, some people long for a return to this. And I think that we can't escape that is an element of this fascination with Mormonism.
Do you see, moving forward, do you see Utah, Salt Lake City, and Latter-day Saints, do you see their influence in pop culture growing, or where do you see that going?
I think it will, because I think I've seen it growing a lot over the last 20 years. And one of the things that was responsible for this was Trey Parker and Matt Stone of South Park fame, who were constantly depicting Mormons in South Park and making fun of them, but doing it in this very affectionate way. And the Book of Mormon, I think, is much the same. Makes fun of Mormons, but in this quite affectionate way that really depicts them as very nice people. I thought that the Book of Mormon was far more offensive to Ugandans than it was to Mormons.
Yes.
And in fact, a lot of Mormons saw this as a potential recruiting tool because it was so affectionate towards Mormons. But we are also seeing just the rise of more and more Mormon content creators is everywhere. The YouTube comedians at Studio C. There's more and more of creating these sort of parallel Mormon versions of pop culture staples. And also, this isn't entirely new. I'm sure that none of your listeners ever will have heard of the Osmonds before, who were a really popular, and very avowedly Mormon boy band in the 1970s. You can think of them as like a white version of the Jacksons. So they have long understood the power of engaging with pop culture, but engaging with pop culture on their own terms. And a lot of people find that distinctiveness really attractive. I think that we're living in a world now where there's more and more room for distinctive subcultures to become really big, even if they're tied to something that is very culturally or religiously or ethnically specific. There's a lot more openness to experience now. So I think that this is only going to get bigger.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for all of your insight.
My pleasure.
All in all, it's clear that several factors have converged to make Utah-based creators a perfect fit for digital culture. Mormonism's strong influence on the state, certain economic advantages, ideological alignment with the broader political zeitgeist, Gen Z's curiosity about faith, it all plays some type of role. But from our research, conversations, and analysis, there are a couple key theories that really stand out. First, the aesthetic factor. Mormonism's visual language, the tidy homes, whiteness, clean girl, minimalism, fits perfectly with the aspirational content that thrives online. Second, the ideological factor. Mormon creators, especially Mormon vloggers, project values that tap into the broader conservative and traditionalist revival online, creating content that resonates with certain audiences and algorithms. Third, the economic factor. As Alyssa Grenfell points out, social media ad ecosystems seemingly benefit Utah-based creators, giving them reach and revenue few others can match, helping this group's overrepresentation. These factors, along with others that we have mentioned, help explain why Mormonism just works online and within our current iteration of internet culture. With this, it's easy to see why Utah, of all places, has become the unlikely capital of the internet. And it looks like it's gonna stay that way for a while. Infinite Scroll is a podcast produced, presented, and co-written by me, Lauren Meisner, for Centennial World. This episode was researched and co-written by Annabelle Ben-David. Editing is by Izzy Phillips. I love you guys so much, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.